So let's get to our next panel focused on housing. Our panel's going to go ahead and take the stage here, and as they do, I will introduce our panelists. Nicole Nosek is founder of Texans for Reasonable Solutions, a nonprofit focused on community-driven policy reform. Dedicated to bridging divides and finding sustainable solutions, Nicole's work centers on impactful change in Texas. She's the chair of the Austin Habitat for Humanity Advocacy Committee and an executive committee board member. Jose Chito Vela is the Austin City Council member for District 4. Before his election to City Council, Vela worked as an immigration and criminal defense lawyer at Walker Gates Vela, a law firm in District 4. He also has legal experience from his time as president of the board of the Workers' Defense Project. And Caroline Chong is Associate Director of Housing and Neighborhoods at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. She's an urban planning researcher and practitioner whose work spans urban heritage conservation, economic development, affordable housing, and urban regeneration. We also welcome back our moderator, Josh Fechter, the Dallas-based urban affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune, covering policy, including housing affordability, housing and property taxes, evictions, policing, and transportation, and politics in Texas's major metropolitan areas. A reminder that you can ask questions of our panel during the presentation at texastribune.org/ask. And for those here in attendance, Flag Us will give you a little card and you can write your questions down there. And with that, I turn the program over to Josh.
Thanks, Matt. At the top here, I'm sure y'all have seen the news, but in case you haven't, wanted to just note that former Houston Mayor, Congressman Sylvester Turner has passed away, and just wanted to take a moment and to give to his memory. All right, well, welcome y'all. Thanks so much for joining us on the panel. This is a panel about the state's housing affordability crisis, what lawmakers and locals can do to solve the crisis, how deep the crisis is, the barriers that we face. Texas has seen housing costs go up quite a bit over the last decade and a half or so. High rents, high home prices. If you're breathing, you are dealing with the housing crisis in some way. Caroline, I wanted you to maybe start us off. What does the housing crisis look like in Houston and Harris County? Who is bearing the brunt of that crisis? And what are some indicators for the people here who may not be familiar for how that crisis is unfolding?
So thank you for that question, especially since we're here in Houston, and I know a lot of people are from outside of Houston. So just to contextualize this, I think, one of the things that has been sort of paramount is that Houston has not been immune to the housing crisis that's shown across the state. We are, as has been noted in the panel before us, a city of renters, where the majority of our households here are renters. And the majority of the households that have been hit in that affordability crisis in the renter sector are Black and Hispanic households. So those are the communities that are being hit the hardest right now in the renters market. The home ownership is increasingly out of reach for a number of our households as well. So we are still, I think, marginally within the country, a relatively affordable city, or one of the largest, the most affordable large cities in the country, I think is a better way to put it. But that gap is shrinking, right? We are still, or we are encroaching upon becoming an unaffordable city, especially for those that are most in need of housing at the lower income and middle income stratum. So that's kind of a picture of where Houston sits. But I think, as we'll get to, the picture is not all dire, but it's certainly one that I think we need to be paying closer attention to.
Nicole, you have eyes kind of at the state level. Tell us kind of what you're seeing, the numbers that you're seeing, what the housing crisis looks like statewide.
Yeah, so we recently, the Texas Comptroller, and big kudos to him, did a deep dive. He did a report where he discussed what exactly is causing the housing affordability crisis. And we're just over 300,000 in deficit across Texas. And I don't want to jump to the cut here, but supply. And of course, there's an important place for what kind of supply, and that's something that we at Texans for Reasonable Solutions are very focused on, missing middle housing. I know that other speakers spoke about other types of housing that we also need to be focused on. But the fact is, you take a look at San Francisco with $1.3 million median home prices. If you don't add supply while also focusing on certain types of housing, you're going to have a fast speed housing crisis.
Councilmember, tell us a little bit about how the housing crisis has looked over the past couple of years in Austin. Obviously, it was hit really hard during the pandemic. You had home prices, skyrocket, rents skyrocket. Tell us, how that, sort of built up and, what's happening now.
Austin's housing crisis was largely self-inflicted. On the one hand, we had this tremendous economic growth, became a focus for so many companies coming to Austin. It's such a huge amount of job creation, very good jobs. On the other hand, we had one of the strictest land development codes, some of the highest permitting, some of the longest timeframes for permitting. And honestly, this was a legacy largely of to a certain extent, environmental protection fights of the 80s and 90s, where Austin was really trying to protect its aquifer and the Barton Springs, the heart of Austin there. But the reality is that we don't want housing on the aquifer, on those environmentally sensitive parts of Austin. But we never really answered the question of, well, where do we want housing? This council, and I think it reached a breaking point when we got to the pandemic. We had really tried, I think, everything in Austin except adding supply. We had, subsidized, we had passed housing bonds, we had done bonuses for developments if they would add affordable housing, but it really wasn't moving the needle. When we saw those, 2020, 2021 prices just skyrocket, I think that the citizens of Austin, the residents of Austin, kind of finally threw their hands up and were like, we've got to change. We have to do something different. And with the more recent councils, and very proud of our council for doing this, we have really moved forward and just allowed folks to build apartments, to build housing throughout the city. It started out in kind of little drips and drabs, but ultimately it turned into some really solid momentum. We eliminated parking requirements because there's a tension between do you build parking or do you build housing? How much parking and how much housing? Again, every single housing development is going to have that tension. And it was clear when we were looking at the numbers and the feedback we were getting from the development community that we were overbuilding parking and underbuilding housing. And now that we've eliminated parking requirements, developments are much better able to kind of scale appropriately. And you've seen again, we're adding 20 units, 30 units per major project. But in dribs and drabs like that, we have actually been able to move the needle. Austin has led the country in the raw number, not per capita, but we're building more housing than cities that are much bigger than us, than New York's and LA's. And we're also building more affordable housing than cities that are much larger than us. And the effects are what everyone expected. We have seen rents drop dramatically over the last 2 years, and that's an exception. It's not that we're not seeing this statewide. We're not seeing this nationally. We're seeing this in Austin because we've been adding about 25,000 housing units per year. That's a huge impact, especially for a district like mine, a working class district, a heavily immigrant district. When rents drop from, let's say, $1,200 a month to $1,100 a month to $1,000 a month, that's money that is going to healthcare, to education, to recreation, to savings, to whatever that family wants. And that's really what's been driving me, is that I do not want my constituents paying 50% of their income in rents. I want them to put a little money back in their pockets and be able to enjoy the beautiful city that they live in, to help their kids to get ahead in life. And so it's been very rewarding seeing the rents drop in Austin.
Right. So I think it's fair to say that at the heart, or at least near the heart, of the state's housing crisis is that Texas has, as you noted, Nicole, this shortage of homes. We are short something like 320,000 homes in the state of Texas. That varies obviously between the various metro areas. And as a result, you see prices go up because there's more competition for for fewer homes, obviously. Then, obviously for low-income folks, they've always faced a shortage of housing. How did that shortage build up? How did we get there? Councilmember, you alluded to some of the things that were perhaps maybe getting in the way. Like, what are y'all's diagnosis of how we got there and kind of like what can be done to alleviate that shortage?
Can I chime in over here? Sure. It's funny, you actually asked me, we had a media interview, I think it was a year ago, and it's a really good question. One person could sit back and look at how much Texas as a whole is building and say, it's enough. We're building more than the entire Bay Area combined in just Houston alone, which, by the way, that's a fact, which is really impressive. But at the end of the day, if you look at the amount of newcomers and incoming people into Texas, and you compare that to how much we are building, the math just simply does not add up. And it's kind of like musical chairs. I wrote an op-ed with an economist maybe about a year and a half ago. And this economist and I, Kevin Erdman, we looked at how trends were going in Los Angeles and how Los Angeles got to the place that it was, and we compared it to Dallas. And it looked eerily similar. And what happens is if you've got, and I'm using a metaphor here, 10 musical chairs and you've got 14 people trying to find those musical chairs, what's going to happen is the people who don't end up in those chairs to begin with, the 4 other people are going to leave. And that tends to be the people who don't have the money to either rent or buy that musical chair. It was also interesting, Alex Horowitz from Pew Trust has come behind us in our policy proposals at the state legislative level in a serious way. He also wrote a report about how, yes, market rate housing helps low income the most here. And I think that's really significant. There's a process called filtering. And even when you're looking at places like Dallas, like Los Angeles, like Austin, if you're not allowing more supply to come onto the market, those naturally occurring affordable housing, which is one of the biggest proponents for affordable housing, homes that are 10 years, 15 years old, obviously they need to be upkept. We need to make sure that we have regulations so that people can live safely. But those units are extraordinarily important. And what you see in housing markets that go awry, like, and I'm sorry to keep repeating itself, like San Francisco, is that the people who have higher incomes will go into what should have been naturally occurring affordable housing. They'll renovate it and they'll make it into a luxury unit or a luxury apartment. Really, in a well-functioning housing market, that unit should have been for a teacher who's making $50,000 or $60,000. And so that's our real hope, is that the policies that the Dallas City Council or Austin City Council or Texas state legislature takes on is able to get ahead of this issue before it's too late and we end up in a situation where, like California, it's above $700,000 for the median home there.
Nicole, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the suite of proposals that you guys are pushing at the legislature?
Yeah, and to be clear, there's been a lot of amazing proposals that are not just things that we've been advocating for. And I'd like to tip my hat here. Whether you're on the red side of the aisle or blue side of the aisle or green or yellow or the whole rainbow, it's really incredible what a bipartisan coalition has come out for the Lieutenant Governor's SB 15, removing barriers to affordable housing. And that's Senator Betancourt, who recently filed this as of yesterday. This is a bill that would allow starter homes in new neighborhoods of 5 acres and more. So we did polling on this, and this is also a bill that passed in the Senate and the House in Arizona. So this is a major bill, and the Lieutenant Governor has mentioned this bill at least 2 or 3 times, whether it's on the diocese or whether it's in interview. What's so beautiful about this is a very similar policy was just passed with my colleague here, the council member, and the city of Austin. So it's especially in 2025, there's not moments that you can really relish where you have City of Austin as well as folks at the state legislature who recognize the problem and are tackling these solutions in very broad bipartisan approaches. So that's one. There's a suite of other bills, but also important to tip our hat to the Speaker of the House, who also prioritized 2 major pro-housing initiatives in the past 2 weeks. That first one, somebody earlier here was talking about the problems around permitting, how long it takes, how expensive it takes. There's so much data out there, but one that I'll pull up is University of Texas Austin has a study that shows every 3.5 months delay adds up to 5% to the final price tag. So you do the math. I know a few years prior to Mayor Kirk Watson stepping in as mayor of Austin, it took 1 to 2 years to get your permits and site plan review back from City of Austin, according to one estimate that I saw. You do the math. 3.5 months, 5%. That adds up to well over 20, 30% of the price of a home, because somebody's paying for the land use consultant, somebody's paying for the expediter, the builder has the holding costs and the interest rate. So the Speaker of the House has prioritized a bill that would allow property owners and builders to decide whether they want to go to a certified, safe, third-party engineer inspector, or whether they want to go the traditional route of going through a city. This has been tried and done in Georgia, in Arizona, and in Florida, and it did speed up a lot of the times, which ultimately meant more affordability. This is carried by Representative Cody Harris. Another one that was recently prioritized yesterday, which I haven't spoken with the council member here, but I imagine that cities will be excited about this. It's something that a lot of folks in the housing community call the tyrant's veto. And this was a law, what I would call an antiquated law from about 100 years ago that was passed by the state legislature. And this is very complicated, but bear with me here. If me and Josh are neighbors, and I own 20% of the land around where Josh is living, and I decide that I want to add a duplex so that I could help my mother-in-law live with me. So maybe she doesn't have enough money for senior care, which a lot of American seniors unfortunately don't, which is why AARP is also tackling this issue in such a serious way. Well, if I decide I want to add a duplex, there's going to be pink notices. One goes out to Josh. If Josh decides he doesn't want me to build that duplex on my house, or he doesn't want me to build a third-story unit if it's not by right allowed by the code, then he can, if he owns 20% of that 200 feet, which is not a lot of land, he can say, no, Nicole, I'm going to say no, send something in to the city permitting office. Well, then if I want to override him, I then have to go all the way and get 75% of the city council members, whether I'm in Georgetown or whether I'm in Dallas or whether I'm in any of the cities across Texas. So this has posed a huge problem. As it was mentioned earlier, I sit on the board of a Habitat for Humanity chapter with one of the highest volume missing middle developers here in Central Texas. What he told me was this law single-handedly is the biggest stopper of missing middle housing. We're talking about housing for teachers, housing for firefighters, EMTs. Over 90% of EMTs in the Austin area live over an hour away from their workplace. That's not only ridiculous and sad, but that's a public safety hazard. So this law would tackle that, and the speaker went ahead and prioritized this most recently.
So, Councilmember, tell us a little bit about kind of some of the reforms that Austin did. And Austin is an interesting case because like Austin's entire political culture around housing like really shifted in like the last couple of years. Can you tell me about kind of like what it was like before that shift happened and what it's like now?
Absolutely. Austin had a very anti-housing culture and anti-development culture. And honestly, a lot of this comes from Austin is a great city. People in Austin, I like to joke about, in Austin, we're obsessed with ourselves. You know, Austinites are obsessed with Austin. Austinites love Austin to death. Everybody wants to keep Austin just the way it was when they fell in love with Austin in 1976. And I mean, it's just not realistic, but there is really a romance around the city. And we were really kind of loving it to death. We were strangling it. Now there has been a change, and honestly, I really would attribute a lot of the change to the kind of generation of voters that came up in the 90s and in the 2000s. You know, when it's one thing when those folks have little kids, you know, they're very kind of protective. They want their neighborhoods to stay the same. They don't want to see development. They want to see things quiet. But now those same households have kids that are 25 years old, and their 25-year-old kids cannot live and afford to live in the neighborhoods that they grew up in. Their 25-year-old kids with decent jobs cannot afford housing in the city that they grew up in and are being forced to move to the suburbs or to the exurbs. I don't want to downplay at all how much that was affecting. I would, you know, during the campaign, I remember I want children to be able to live in the neighborhoods that they grew up in. I want children to be able to rent in the neighborhoods that they grew up in. And you could see the parents in the crowd just saying like, absolutely, absolutely. So there's this huge change driven by folks not being able to afford a house in Austin. And I have to also give a lot of credit to the pro-housing groups that formed in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s. Aura is a very prominent housing group, and they just kind of kept at it. And again, it was kind of a drib and a drab. First, we allowed ADUs on a lot of single-family lots in the city of Austin. Then there was affordability unlocked, which Connor Kenny mentioned. There was a huge boost for affordable housing in Austin, but there was still not the willingness to kind of tackle the core problems that were really limiting housing development. And those were our compatibility rules, which really the compatibility, to try and explain it in as simple of way as I can, is a force field that emanates from a single family home, limiting all development around it to 30 feet in height, and a little bit farther out it goes up. But basically, because there's so many single family homes in Austin, there was virtually no site that was not limited by compatibility. And this, in many people's estimates, you know, an apartment complex was losing 20, 30%, maybe 40% of the units that they could build because of these compatibility rules. And these compatibility rules, they would even cross the street. You know, the houses, the single family homes are on the other side of the street, but the force field extends over on this side. So it was just really, there were a lot of rules like that were very problematic and were squelching our housing production. And we really just kind of went through and dismantled them kind of one by one. We reduced compatibility to just a 75-foot radius around the house, which again is trying to strike a very reasonable balance where it can't be right up next to the house, but again, we limited it to where that freed up a lot of property for higher developments and created a lot of additional housing. The parking rules were a really big deal. And not just because there's less parking, but and what we're seeing, I should say, what we're seeing from developers is that the projects that they're working on, they're probably building, it's not that they're not building parking, but they're building maybe about 70%, maybe 60% of the parking that they used to build. And again, that leaves more land for housing. And we're not seeing any real problems created by that. Even, single family homes are still putting a parking space in the driveway, but there's just more flexibility along those reins. And then finally, we have really pushed on our transit-oriented development. We just passed a set of guidelines called the ETOD, Equitable Transit-Oriented Development, that surrounds our high-capacity transit lines. We're in the process of trying to build a rail line, if the Texas Attorney General will let us. And we want to put a lot of housing right around that transit line. We have now allowed buildings up to 120 feet along our light rail line, which was a huge change, and we're really hoping to boost housing construction along that transit line. And that's really where you get that kind of the double hit to affordability. You get more housing, and the folks that are living in that housing next to the transit line don't maybe have to own a car anymore, or maybe the family can own just one car instead of multiple vehicles. So we're really just trying to push on supply as much as possible and move toward a real kind of transit-oriented city.
Caroline, this is a question that has sort of perplexed me for a little while now. Houston obviously is sort of famously does not have traditional zoning. It's thought to be easier to build here. A lot of this conversation so far is focusing on supply, and Houston is generally like more affordable than its major peers, right? So I wanted to give you a chance to sort of tell us a little bit, kind of like what your diagnosis is when you're talking to folks at the office at the Kinder Institute, and kind of what your findings have been. Obviously, like Houston is kind of held up as this, pinnacle or, a way to sort of bring about affordability, but it still faces an affordability crisis. Its eviction rates are high. Obviously, there are large numbers of folks who are experiencing homelessness, although the city is bringing that down. Tell us a little bit about kind of why Houston, despite this, is sort of facing an affordability crisis.
So I think it's a complicated question. I think in part, so we don't have zoning. That's sort of, everybody talks about that. We're a special butterfly in that sense. But to say that we don't have zoning sort of writ large is correct, but also incorrect. And because while we don't have a zoning code per se that, across the city as other cities in Texas do, we do have a number of policies and sort of layers, I guess we could call them, that do control what people can do with their homes in terms of construction, sometimes in terms of use. Those are obviously much more localized in terms of HOAs and whatnot. So we do have controls at some level, but not necessarily at the sort of citywide zoning level. So there is some control in that realm. Whether those trickle up to actually impacting affordability in some degrees, yes, I think they do in certain pockets and in certain neighborhoods. But moving beyond that question about zoning, I think a lot of the challenges that Houston has faced are related exactly to these questions and these issues that my fellow panelists have also pointed out. We have the basic issues of supply and demand, obviously, where demand is just outstripping supply, and that is sort of the basic fundamentals of housing, right? We have an influx of people coming into the city, and the supply is just not keeping pace with that. But I think in terms of responding to that, I think what we've pointed out so far is that there's obviously this challenge that, yes, we need to bring some more supply online, right? And this issue of middle market housing and this question of filtering is incredibly important. And it's one that we need to push much harder. But there's the sort of flip side of that is that filtering is not foolproof, right? The bringing online of NOAA is not something that works 100% of the time, especially when we have housing markets that are increasingly constrained, which is something that can happen. And as Nicole pointed out, we have a process where housing sometimes can filter upward. There was a great study that just came out a couple of years ago that looked at housing or cities across the country over a 10-year span, and found that that filtering works Sometimes, most of the time, but there are certain situations, certain cities where it does not work, and we need to be mindful of what the conditions are that inhibit the bringing online of NOAA in those instances, and see how we can kind of get out of the way of the filtering process in those markets. And I think one of the other side that we've all pointed out is that we need to bring more supply online, but there's the flip side of that, which Councilman has pointed out and has been greatly successful in Austin, where there's the policy side that needs to also enable supply to come online, right? So it's the question of how do we bring more supply online? It's great that, yes, we need to allow builders to build, but what can we do to bring certain kinds of housing that we need most? And there's the spatial component to it too, right? That I think the presenter before us pointed out that in Austin, the majority of building has occurred in greenfields, I think is what you said, right? So this question of, do we just build more housing on the outskirts, right? But the construction of housing actually in an infill sense might be what that community needs more, or if not more, then there needs to be a stronger focus of infill housing. And that's something that I think in Houston specifically that we are trying to focus on in a more concerted effort. We have a community land trust that has really taken off in recent years and has done great work with brownfield remediation and then also, doing more urban infill projects. We have a land bank too here in the city that is working with the Community Land Trust to actually do a lot of that work as well. So I think it needs to be sort of a multi-pronged approach, and one that in Houston we are trying to address in that way.
If I could jump in, the filtering conversation has really been a fascinating conversation. In Austin, we were really kind of talking past each other a lot of times where there was this like, well, we need more housing, but it needs to be affordable housing. And we would kind of come to a deadlock and that we're not going to support it if it's not affordable. What we've seen as we've brought on the supply is that rents have dropped. Not just, and again, the criticism is that, oh, these are all new luxury apartments. Again, I think that's more of a marketing gimmick than anything else, but, that it is what it is. But, we've seen a lot of nice new apartments, mostly geared toward the higher end of the market, or at least the middle of the market, definitely not geared toward the low end. But because of the additional supply, we have seen rents fall at all levels. The high-end rents have dropped a lot. Your middle rents have dropped a lot, and what they call your Class C, which is a lot of my district, those really kind of run-down apartments that have zero amenities. All they offer is a home. Those rents have also dropped across the city in all locations. So it's been a really instructive to see that happening. The one area that, in thinking about where the state could help, that 30% of average median income level, because the market will solve. I think if we're adding supply, if we're building housing, especially if we're doing infill housing, which the city council is going to be taking up actually at this next meeting, we're going to be making some changes to the site plan requirements to try and really boost infill housing. But we can probably serve about 90% or so of the people on a market basis with reasonably priced apartments if we're doing things right on the policy side, on the supply side. But there's always going to be a segment of folks, again, the elderly, disabled, that are not going to be able to afford market rent regardless of what that market rent is, and we're going to have to help them. That, when I think about where can the state help, that is really where we need that help. There is the low-income housing tax credits, which are very helpful. The city has passed affordable housing bonds, which then leverage the low-income housing tax credits. If there was another layer, if the state would come in with some money to provide additional support, we could get that deeply affordable housing out there and hopefully get folks off the streets, get folks into housing that they can afford and still afford food and medicine and all the other things that we need to survive.
Right. So I think it's a good time to sort of go into the state preemption versus local control sort of argument. A lot of the bills that you're supporting, Nicole, and that a lot of the proposals that are getting sort of the most attention in the ledge right now are kind of geared towards, sort of setting a floor for cities to go, to basically build housing, right? And so tell me kind of how, you're sort of approaching that argument. The state has kind of been on this, this long push for the last decade to sort of preempt cities in ways. How are you sort of navigating those conversations in as these bills sort of progress?
Yeah, and to start out this conversation, there was a staffer at the Texas legislature, really smart guy, and he mentioned he has not seen one Texas state legislator on the left or on the right who has never voted for a preemption bill. Point being is that when you go up into that state legislature and you're voting, the fact is it is almost impossible to not vote for a preemptive policy. But as an aside, I want to point out, as an organization, a community organization that we were talking to recently pointed out, not all preemption is bad. And I think that is super important to understand. You take a look at civil rights, and you take a look at the federal government. Ruby Bridges, how many folks here remember who Ruby Bridges was? Raise your hand. She was the brave African-American girl who decided to go to school, even when there were certain schools that wouldn't allow an African-American girl to go to school with Caucasian kids. Well, there was federal preemption there to make sure that Ruby Bridges could go to school. And so this is one clear instance in which things are so dire that when one level is not addressing the issue, another level is, in my opinion, held responsible for doing what one branch of government isn't. Now, when Texans for Reasonable Solutions was created, at the time, we did not, in the city of Austin did not have folks like Chito Vela who were pro-housing. And as a result, we were seeing the middle class, poor, EMTs, teachers being driven out day after day after day. And so there was a real need to start something at the state level. We've seen impressive results with City of Austin going down by 12% because of their oversupply of housing. As a side note, it's still not where it was pre-pandemic levels, so people are still being driven out. But the fact is that I'm worried that if we wait for City of Dallas, if we wait for all these other cities that are growing outside of the major metropolitans to get to the levels of unaffordability that City of Austin is at, it becomes very hard to reverse that course. So my question here is there's two paths that we could take. We could look at what California has done. They do have a concerted effort to try to bring their housing prices down, but the fact is that they have gotten so high, and there's been so many laws to make it hard to build missing middle housing that it's hard to reverse that course. Then you take a look at Houston, which I agree, Houston we still need to do some work, especially for the lowest brackets of income, absolutely. But you still see that there are policies that you can take, whether it's reducing the minimum lot size requirements, allowing people to have a starter home with a 1,400 square foot lot. It's important to remember in the 1940s, something like over half of the homes that people would buy were about 1,400 square foot homes. So this is something that we had. Now, our generation now is being historically priced out. There was a stat that just came out, 24% of the home purchases in the last year, only 24% of them were first-time home buyers. That is historically the lowest that it has ever been. That is a problem for people in their 20s, 30s. The American dream of home ownership, we need to make sure that the people who have homes aren't shutting the door on their grandkids and their kids on the way out. The Utah governor recently passed a slate of bills, I think it was a year ago, and he had a really brilliant quote where he said, "Do you want your kids to live with you or do you want them to live by you?" And it's a strategic, very appropriate question. Where are our kids going to live? And the third thing that the Utah governor wasn't mentioning is, do you want your kid to live in another state because they can't afford to live in Texas anymore? And that's the reality that we're looking down. So the question of preemption, yes, preemption, no. The fact is, I'm open to whoever's willing to solve the problem, but unfortunately, to date, what we have seen is that Colorado, Utah, Florida, states from all across the spectrum have dove into this problem because, unfortunately, it does not appear that city council members, besides my colleague over here, are willing to take those brave votes. What's also interesting, and I'll end after this sentence here, is that you look at Pew Trust. There is so much support for these policies that have proven results. A lot of the policies that Texans for Reasonable Solutions is focused on, Pew Trust found that over 7 out of 10 of Texans support those policies. But the fact is, historically, when you have the same 5 people who moved to their cities in 1975 and they don't want to see a new home show up 5 acres over, when those same 5 people are showing up all the time to say no to new homes, but then you have the middle class who has 2 kids and they're working long hours at a job and they're not there because they're working, trying to build their lives, that creates a policy mismatch of incentives where the majority has not been historically served. And so I think that's what's different about preemption in housing, and I think that is what Speaker Dustin Burrows, that's what Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and even you find that Democrats like John Busey and other Democrats like Nathan Johnson are filing bills to try to get at this issue at the state level.
Councilmember, is what she's talking about, does that approach worry you to some degree in terms of the preemption side? But also, I mean, obviously Austin is an outlier on some of these matters. What kind of advice would you have for local officials who want to tackle these things in their communities?
Tackle them. And I completely agree with what Nicole was talking about, where you sometimes have the loudest voices at these planning commission meetings, at city council meetings, being very opposed to the new apartments down the street, but they're very much often in the minority. That the majority of the neighbors are either neutral or positive, but people really don't go out and tell you, I support this new development or I'm neutral on this. They come out and tell you when they don't like something. You know, especially on council, in public office, you always get the bad news. You never get the good news. You know, silence is like, well, I guess, you know, everybody supports that because we didn't get any angry emails about it. What worries me thinking about the state level is Governor Abbott talking about moving the number of votes that you would need to pass a bond. That, talk about killing cities. I mean, first of all, we have the revenue caps at 3.5%, where you cannot collect essentially any more than 3.5% of property taxes from one year to the next. When in Austin, when you combine inflation and population growth, we probably need, 5%. Our expenses are probably going up, in the 4%, 4.5%, just to try and maintain and support the current infrastructure that we have, to pay our public safety people, to continue to maintain transportation and parks and all those kinds of things like that. Connor Kenny was just talking about the how much construction costs have increased. That applies across the board, not just in housing, but that applies to your water infrastructure, your electric infrastructure. So when I see, again, first we have these 3.5% caps, which are really choking the supply, choking the ability of local governments to provide the services that they're supposed to provide. Now we're talking about a 2/3 majority required to approve a bond. I mean, in Austin, thanks to our residents, thanks to our voters, we might hit that number every once in a while, but there are communities that will never be able to get 2/3 majority to approve whatever that bond may be. I mean, it may be to, open the gates of heaven, and if there's a tax implication, there will be, 40% of the folks it will vote against it. So when I look at the Texas legislature, those are the things that worry me, that the state continues to really try to shackle local communities from trying to solve the problems that we're facing every day, and the financial shackles are my major concern.
I think we've got about 11 minutes for audience Q&A.
Wonderful. Lots of questions that have come in. I'll try to group some of them. Some of these may have been some questions you touched on kind of after they were submitted, but I'll read them and see if there's additional info you want to provide. A few questions here about homelessness and gentrification. Person writes, can you address how homelessness and gentrification are addressed as approaches to the housing issue are developed? This one person writes, what support, if any, is provided to homeowners in poor communities who are being forced out by gentrification and thus increasing their taxes? Adds the note about older homeowners being forced out. I'll leave that there and then have a follow-up question.
Caroline, do you want to start us off?
The big questions. It's a huge challenge, and a much, we need to address that in a very dire way. The gentrification question, first, I always like to say this, that gentrification and displacement are two aligned issues, but they are not the same thing. Gentrification is we refer to it as a much larger overhead broad term to imply, improvements to a neighborhood, but those improvements obviously have trickle-down effects, one of which in many situations is displacement. So just to be very clear, I think we as a public consciousness need to kind of understand the distinctions between gentrification and displacement, and also how they relate to each other. Moving on from that distinction, the issues with gentrification and displacement obviously hit lower income communities, most of which, or many of the times, which are communities of color. And the challenge with that is we have two types of displacement, where we have the market-led gentrification and sort of the government-led gentrification, which you think of in terms of big developments coming down, or highway construction, right? These big projects that push people out and push communities out. The market-led gentrification is one in which I think we need to actually have a little bit more public involvement in terms of government protections. And those can come in the forms of market protections. In other cities, we've seen certain levels of success with tax abatements, which in a city like Houston, or in a state like Texas, where we have incredible property taxes, which was already mentioned, tax abatements, whether they're 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, have proven successful in many situations. But addressing it at different levels, different financial levels, to allow communities to stay when they want to stay, I think is a mechanism that we really need to address, most, I think, successfully through the levers of tax and tax relief. But I also should say that within this conversation, there's also this question, there's this, I think, broad assumption that the people who are in these communities, that they across the board want to stay in these communities. And many times that is very, very true. That people want to stay in their communities. They don't want to be displaced. They don't want to leave. They've grown up in these communities, as we've talked about. But we can't ignore that the subset of those populations of people who may not want to stay, and who may want to take that 300% increase in their property value and take that equity that they've earned and that they've gained in their house and go somewhere else. And so, we need to find mechanisms that allow both sets of the population to be served in that vein. And I think, as I said, tax abatements have proven to be one successful measure, but the gentrification question is a very big one that I think people who work in more localized communities like Austin may have, answers to.
That it's a heart of the debate right there. And the distinction between gentrification and displacement is absolutely critical. New sidewalks, new playground equipment at the park, bike lanes, those are good things for a neighborhood. Those are not bad things for a neighborhood. And there's this idea among, again, some folks that we don't want any of those things because then that leads to gentrification, displacement. I reject that. This whole kind of idea of keeping the neighborhood bad so that they don't move in, I just think that's a very negative approach. The question to me, the critical question, we don't want gentrification and displacement in particular. We don't want displacement, but what can we do to prevent displacement? There's this idea that if we don't let them build, we protect our neighborhood from displacement. And at this point, that's just false. I would say that California is probably the best example of, even Boston. I think of just so many cities that have really, in the name of keeping neighborhoods the same, have just clamped down on any kind of new development. And the reality is that rich folks with money will always be able to, offer enough to get somebody out of their home. It seems to me, defer to the academics on this, but I look around the country and the places that have been able to slow displacement are places that build new housing so that the new residents, the wealthier residents, have a place to buy, and they're not buying that little, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 900 square foot house. There's a brand new condo just down the street that they can buy, or there's some new housing that they can buy, and they're not having to. My sense of it, and again, the Austin situation is on my mind, but if we don't give people places to buy and places to live, they will push out other folks and take their housing. So the solution sure seems to be, again, a more supply-oriented solution and not a don't build anything and we'll end up in a better place.
Can I just add one quick thing? To add what the council member was saying, there was actually a really interesting study that compared communities that built moderately and then communities that built barely anything. And what they found was that there was 17% less residents that were leaving the communities that built barely anything. So I think this is really important. We can look at actual deep dive studies of this. There's another study where they built a 200-unit apartment building in a relatively low-income area. And what they found was immediately when they were market rate apartments, immediately when those market rate apartments went up, the surrounding rents dropped by 6%. 6% after a 200-unit market rate apartment went up. If that's not a way of helping alleviate affordability for people within their community, I don't know what is.
We're going to, we have a lot of questions here, so we're going to go over a couple minutes here. I want to try to get to a few of these. But this person writes that HUD has announced cuts of up to 85% of homelessness response funds under Elon Musk. Has this started setting off alarms at the Capitol and city halls?
Massive alarms. The HUD cuts that are proposed are going to be devastating. I just don't know. This is absolutely the wrong time to be cutting HUD funding for affordable housing, for homelessness prevention efforts. That's going to be just a disaster.
I'll just echo that. Yeah, it is going to be disastrous. I think one of the things I spent much of my life in the Northeast, where the philanthropic sector has a very different relationship with city government, and one of the things since moving down here that I have noticed is that philanthropy and government here works in a very different way than it does in the Northeast. And here in Houston, we've just announced a $70 million effort to end homelessness, and while that's led by the city. necessarily, but there is, what was interesting to me, or what stood out to me, was the sort of implicit reliance on the philanthropic sector to make very strong and significant contributions to that. So I think, yes, the HUD cuts are going to be absolutely devastating, and I think we're going to see increasing reliance on the philanthropic sectors to fill the gap to the extent that that's possible.
I have a couple questions, and this is where we can end, but specifically you're asking about the kind of role and action that counties can take. And I'll ask them both and then see how the panelists want to respond. What role can counties take in promoting housing development and affordable housing, particularly for urban areas like Harris County? And the other question, the person writes, a lot of new urban development is happening in unincorporated areas. What can we do at the county level, knowing that our available resources are very limited compared to cities?
You want to give that a shot?
The question was, what can the city and the county do to increase affordable housing?
I think specifically at the county level.
At the county level. So I think at the county level, so one of the things that I think we have seen here is that there is great coordination in Houston specifically at this moment, and I'm going to say that at this moment, between the city and the county. And I think that is one of our strengths, and I think we need to lean on that, this collaboration between the city and county, because it's not always the case where we have that kind of a relationship. So it's fabulous. I think the city or the county rather needs to understand, like we've said, who their constituents are and what their needs are. And I think, one of the things that we've been trying to do is understand better who is moving out to the county and figure out, identify, do we need, as part of that, more efforts towards TOD, transit-oriented development, to get some of these workers, many of whom work downtown, to downtown, because this is, it's a system, right? They don't sort of live in isolated pockets out in these, sort of suburban, ex-urban communities. So the county, I think, one of those, that's a big issue right now, is understanding from a demographic perspective. Point one, who is moving out to the county at a more fine-grained, nuanced level, and building out from there.
All right. With that, I want to thank our panel, thank Josh for pulling double duty today with our opening panels. We are going to take a 15-minute break or so, reconvene at 11:15, refill on coffee. I'm sure some of our speakers will stick around if you have any questions for them or getting to know other attendees. Thanks so much.